Good morning. After almost 3 years, I'm back emceeing at Friendly House and so excited to be here with you all this morning. We've got a really nice crowd. This is a cheer. I think part of this is we've got a great speaker here who draws a crowd. So welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Helen Christians. I'll be your MC this morning. And I want to welcome those folks here at Friendly House. Dave?
My reading this morning is from Shakespeare, and it's from the only play that he wrote that was about the ancient Greek Trojan War. The name of the play is Troilus and Cressida, and I'll be reading it in a moment. But in order to really get what's going on here, I think that it'd be useful for me to introduce some historical context. The play was written in 1603, and at that time, people viewed the Copernican world system, where the sun is at the center of everything, hadn't yet taken root. As a matter of fact, it did not until later. 1628, 1629 is the year when Galileo was hauled before the Inquisition to defend the sun-centered system of the world. So even though Copernicus had originated it back in 1543, it didn't take hold until the late 1620s with Galileo. And the other thing I'll just throw in as an interesting tidbit is that Galileo and Shakespeare were exact contemporaries. They were both born in 1564. However, the most important thing as you listen to this reading is to see that at that time, in the early 1600s, people saw a direct parallel between order in the external universe, in particular the planets going around the Earth, and the world order in human society. Those things mirrored one another. And so with all that as a background, I will do the reading. Troilus and Cressida, Act 1, Scene 3, speech by Ulysses. The heavens themselves, the planets and this center, observe degree, priority, and place, insisture, course, proportion, season, form, office, and custom in all line of order. And therefore is the glorious planet Sol, that's the sun, in noble eminence enthroned and sphered amidst the others, whose medicinable eye corrects the ill aspects of planets' evil. But when the planets in evil mixture to disorder wander, what plagues, what portents, what mutiny, what raging of the sea, shaking of the earth, commotion in the winds, frights, changes, horrors, divert and crack, rend and deracinate the unity and married calm of states quite from their fixture. Oh, when degree is shaked, the enterprise is sick. How could communities, brotherhoods, commerce, prerogative of age, but by degree stand in authentic place? Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility. The rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose limits justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite, a universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey, and at last eat up himself. So that's today's cheery reading.
Oh, thank you, Lauren, so much for your presentation and for that interesting reading. Thank you. Well, we're ready now for a presentation. Our topic today is post-mortem on the 2022 elections, and I'd like to just do a brief introduction of our wonderful speaker. Dr. Jeff Seward is one of HCP's most popular speakers. I just want to thank him for coming and doing a deep debriefing of this election. I'm really looking forward to this. Jeff was born in Chicago and grew up in an Air Force family. He earned his Ph.D. in political science from Stanford. He spent 3 years doing field work for his dissertation in Brazil, where he also met his Peruvian wife, Maria. The dissertation eventually turned into a book published by Routledge Press. And the title of that book is The Politics of Capitalist Transformation, Brazilian Informatics Policy. Formatics, I'm sorry. Policy, Regime Change, and State Autonomy. And this book is available currently on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and on Kindle. Prior to joining the faculty at Pacific University in 1990, Jeff taught for 3 years at the University of Texas in San Antonio, and before that worked as a reporter and prize-winning documentary film producer for public television stations in Boise and Seattle. During his 32 years at Pacific, Jeff has taught over 40 different courses that have been cross-listed in a multitude of other departments. Jeff retired from Pacific University on September 1st of this year and is now listed as at Pacific as Professor Emeritus. Jeff will be taking questions after his formal presentation has ended. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. This is my 16th or 17th presentation at the Humanists, and it brought to my mind an old song by Roger Miller. You all know the song Kansas City Star? I'm a Kansas City star, it's what I are. Well, I wrote a little adaptation of that, and if you will bear with me, I'll sing it for you. I'm a H.G. Portland star, that's what I are. Yodel-deedle-dee, you ought to see my car. I drive a big old Cadillac with wire wheels, got rhinestones on the spokes. I got credit down at the grocery store and my barber tells me jokes. I'm the #1 attraction, every friendly house parking lot. I'm the king of H.G. Portland. No thanks to Clackamas. Thanks a lot. So thanks for inviting me back. I love coming here. You're such a good audience, and it has inspired me, and we'll talk about this during announcements, to offer to teach some of my Pacific classes to people who want to sign up for those. So I'll get into that during announcements. Democrats in American democracy just dodged a bullet. Unfortunately, the Republican enemies of democracy still have a lot of other bullets they can fire. They have lost a battle, but the war is still unresolved. I'm speaking figuratively, of course, but it's also true literally. When it comes to the general public, the enemies of democracy in America have a lot more guns and bullets than the supporters of democracy do. If our political divisions ever do end up descending into violence, MAGA America is much better armed than the rest of us are. But returning to the elections, I think it's important to understand that Democrats did not win a big victory. What they accomplished was mainly a heroic defense against what should have been a red wave. Why should there have been a red wave? Well, because first-term presidents almost always lose a lot of seats in the House of Representatives in their first midterm election. This is Biden's first midterm election. The average loss is about 25 seats. When the president's approval rating is low, as Joe Biden's is, in the low 40s, and people are unhappy with the state of the economy, the result is usually much worse, a loss of 30, 40, 50, even 60 seats. But the Democrats didn't pick up seats. It wasn't a victory in that sense. They simply prevented this red wave. So it looks like the Republicans in the final tally are going to win something like 5 to 10 seats, and there's still an outside chance that the Democrats will retain their majority in the House, although it seems unlikely. And in the Senate, at worst, the Democrats broke even. Now, it's going to be 50-50 at worst. And if they win the Georgia seat, they will actually add one seat to their razor-thin majority. Not a single Democratic incumbent lost their Senate seat. There were even some significant Democratic victories in other major races. For example, they flipped the governor's seat in Maryland and Massachusetts from Republican to Democratic. Maybe even more important, they flipped state legislatures in Michigan, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. This last achievement is especially satisfying because Republicans have steadily gained ground in state legislatures during the last 10 to 15 years. During the Obama presidency, especially, Democrats just hemorrhaged state legislative seats. They just didn't pay much attention or make much of an effort at that level. And the result has been wildly extremist Republican majorities in state legislatures across the country. In Wisconsin, for example, I think it's the worst in some ways, the Republican majority gerrymandered the state so outrageously that even when Democrats win a majority of the vote there, Republicans win over 60% of the seats in the state legislature. When a Democrat was elected governor, they proceeded to pass a law stripping him of much of his statutory authority. And that's because Democrats dropped the ball on working on legislative races in the state of Wisconsin. And the same thing has happened in other places in the country. I think the North Carolina legislature also stripped the Democratic governor of a bunch of his statutory authority when he was elected. The state legislature level of our politics is also where the most egregious anti-abortion legislation has emerged, even before the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. There were states where there were essentially no abortion clinics because of weird regulations that state legislatures passed on them, and generated a constant and toxic stream of anti-LGBTQT legislation, efforts to prevent serious examination of racism in public school history classes, and interference with the academic freedom and academic integrity of public universities across the country. So Democratic success at the state legislative level is a very welcome development. There was also partial good news about defeating election deniers. In the swing states that determined the last presidential election, only one election denier was elected to statewide office. That's Joe Lombardo. He was elected governor of Nevada, but Nevada also has elected a Democratic Secretary of State that's the official that actually oversees the election. Everywhere else, besides that one governor seat in Nevada, in swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, election deniers running for governor or secretary of state were defeated. That's very reassuring. But I call it only partial good news because across the country, hundreds of election deniers, mostly in red states, were elected. More than half of all Republican candidates for state office across the country were election deniers, and most of them won. The Senate now has two additional election deniers, J.D. Vance from Ohio and Ted Budd from North Carolina, who replaced Rob Portman and Richard Burr, both of whom recognized Donald Trump's defeat. So we actually have more election deniers in the Senate than we had before. There are now at least 4 secretaries of state, 7 governors, and 10 senators who are election deniers. There are also more election deniers among Republicans in the House than there were before. Half a dozen Republicans who accepted Joe Biden's victory were either defeated in Republican primaries or retired when it became clear that they had no future in Republican politics. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are just the most famous examples, but there are 3 or 4 others as well. One analyst has counted 153 Republican election deniers in the House now, including about 20 who are new to the Congress. So election denialism is not going away in the Republican Party. These 153 election deniers will constitute more than 2/3 of the entire Republican caucus in the House. And they're sitting there waiting for the 2024 election. The mainstream of the Republican Party is still deeply committed to rejecting the legitimacy of elections that they lose. And that constant rhetoric is still fuel for crazy fanatics who feel justified in resorting to violence because they are convinced that the electoral system is rigged. One of the worst examples of this was just the other day. The race in Nevada for senator was very close, and the Republican candidate Laxalt was running ahead of Cortez Masto by a small margin, half a percentage point, and there were still a lot of votes to be counted, and they were mostly from Democratic areas. Lindsey Graham went on TV on Fox News and said it was mathematically impossible for Laxalt to lose. And so that if he did lose, it was because he'd been cheated. To his credit, Laxalt himself, and I think this was in part reaction to what Lindsey Graham said, before it flipped over and Cortez Masto had a lead, like 36 hours ago or something, Laxalt put out a tweet saying, it's not looking good. We have a very thin lead and the remaining votes are mainly for Democrats. And so it looks like we may get overtaken. That was really impressive to me, given the fact that Laxalt is a notorious election denier. But he didn't claim that he was being cheated out of his seat, unlike Kari Lake in Arizona, who is behind and is claiming that there's election fraud going on. It's not clear how that race is going to come out. There's an interesting irony there. I heard someone mention the other day, Kari Lake, before the election, was saying, no votes should be counted that aren't already counted on election night. The election night vote should be it, shouldn't count any more votes. Well, if they'd done that, she would have lost because she was trailing on election night, as it turns out. She still has some hope that the same day ballots that were mail-in ballots but were turned in on election day in the boxes may be Republican. In 2018, they were Democratic. In 2020, they were Republican. The ones that have come in so far have been modestly Republican. And so it's not clear whether she's going to end up elected or not. But I'm all for just saying, let's just use the election night figures for that race. Give her what she wants, How about some other miscellaneous thoughts? Were the polls wrong? Well, in some cases, yes. They clearly missed the Republican wave in Florida, where Santos won by 20 points and Rubio won by 17 points. The polls had those much closer. They had Rubio ahead by 6 or 8 points, and DeSantos ahead by something like that. And so nobody anticipated such a huge wave there. In Miami-Dade County, Hillary Clinton, when she ran, won Miami-Dade County by 30 points. Ron DeSantos won Miami-Dade County by 11 points. So there's a 41-point swing to the Republicans in Miami-Dade County since Hillary Clinton ran for president. And the polls didn't pick that up. They saw Florida as much closer than that. In the beginning, Democrats really had some hope. They had a very strong candidate for Senate against Marco Rubio, Val Demings, the former police chief, a former congresswoman who a wonderful speaker, but she didn't come even close. They had some other races being very tight. Gretchen Whitmer's race in Michigan, they were saying, she might even lose. Well, she ended up winning by 10 or 11 points. So they missed some. But overall, nonpartisan professional polling did pretty well. NBC, for example, in its last poll, had the generic ballot for the House. Would you like to see the Democrats control it or the Republicans? They had that more or less even. And they also had more or less even the question about voter enthusiasm. Are you enthusiastic about coming out to vote? This is seen as a good predictor of turnout. And Democrats had been running behind on that most of the campaign, but that last NBC poll showed them exactly even with Republicans, which seems to be about what happened. So the professional pollsters in general did not bad. Why then was there all the talk about a red wave? Well, a whole slew of partisan, non-professional polls done by Republican-leaning outfits had Republicans up 3 to 5% more than reality. But poll averagers like Real Clear Politics, which tends to sort of lean conservative anyway, and also 538, run by Nate Silver, sometimes included some or all of these partisan polls in their averages. The partisan Republican pollsters were essentially engaged in gaslighting the public, and that message got reinforced by Fox News and other right-wing media. And since history seemed to point to big Democratic losses and a big Republican victory, even mainstream nonpartisan media hedged their bets a little and partially bought into the red wave narrative. And there's a lot of self-reflection about that going on in the mainstream media. How do we protect ourselves against buying into a gaslighting narrative? What about the abortion backlash? Every state with an abortion-related measure on the ballot ended up with a pro-choice outcome, including in Kentucky and in Montana. And the ballot measure in Montana was especially interesting because what it was, it said doctors must give life-saving care to an abortion fetus that's alive and has been delivered. Well, that's a pretty sympathetic way to frame the pro-life position. But that lost too. Montanans voted that down, even though they were electing Republican congresspeople and Republican statewide offices. The abortion issue, there are a lot of Republican voters who do not support abortion restrictions. And that also meant that there were a lot of people who were not very happy with Joe Biden, who were very upset about inflation, pretty upset about rising crime, who nevertheless voted for Democrats because of the abortion issue. However, and so for conservatives, the Dobbs decision may be a case of be careful what you wish for, but they're still celebrating it, despite the election results. Samuel Alito and Amy Conant Barrett have both recently given triumphal speeches to the Conservative Federalist Society. They were cheered like heroes by this group that has been essentially the nominating institution for Republican judicial appointments. For myself, I think it's wildly inappropriate for Supreme Court justices to give speeches to highly partisan activist groups. I think it would be highly inappropriate for Democrats to do it and highly inappropriate for these Republicans to do it. But they're doing it, and they were greeted with cheers. How about democracy as a factor? I have a slightly different take on this than some people have been giving. I think democracy as an abstraction in itself didn't move voters very much. Polls show that just as many Republicans are concerned that democracy is under threat as Democrats do. Now, they think so for exactly opposite reasons. Republicans think democracy is under threat because the Democrats are stealing elections. Democrats think democracy is under threat because they think Republicans want to steal elections. But there are just as many Republicans who say democracy is under threat. I don't think people voted to save democracy. I think Americans fundamentally feel like American democracy is something that can't be changed, can't be lost, it's beyond the thing. But what they didn't like is election denialism, specifically. I think that offends people who aren't drinking the Kool-Aid, who are still attached to reality. It offends people. A big majority realize it is a lie and also find the constant baseless challenges to election results as poor sportsmanship, as people who are poor, bad losers. And Americans are trained from an early age that you're not supposed to be a bad loser, right? If your team loses, you go over and you congratulate the other team. You line up and shake hands. Don't whine about the referees. People in professional sports who whine about the referees and are in other ways saying somehow it was stolen, people react very negatively to that. And so I think election denialism really did play a big role in independents and even some Republicans, especially in swing states, voting against Secretary of State candidates and governor candidates who were election denials. Some interesting data from exit polls. The youth vote is the only age bracket that voted Democratic, and they did so overwhelmingly. Overall, voters under 30 voted for Democrats, 63 to 35. That's overwhelming. No other age group voted Democratic. Voters under 30 who were Black, 89% voted Democratic. 68% of Latino voters under 30 voted Democratic. And 58% of white voters under 30 voted Democratic. In Arizona, 76% of youth voted for Mark Kelly. This was a huge boost for the Democrats. While the white vote is, however, still heavily Republican. Even white women voted majority Republican. White women voted Republican 53 to 45, despite the abortion issue. And Republicans are also enjoying a slight edge in party identification. 36% of voters identify as Republicans against only 33% who identify as Democrats, and the rest identify as independent. Polarization continues to get worse and worse. I saw an interesting study that noticed that in the 1970s, they asked people to rate the opposing party. On a scale of 1 to 100, how do you feel about the opposing party? 100 saying, yeah, they're fine. 0 being they're satanic, right? In the 1970s, people, both Republicans and Democrats, rated the other party's supporters at about 57 on a scale of 100. Now it's 20. They also asked, is there a big difference between the parties? In 1970s, about 40% of the public said there's a big difference between the parties. Now 80% say there's a big difference. Now I think that reflects the reality. I think there is a bigger difference between the parties today than there was in the 70s, but it shows how polarized we're becoming. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are just farther and farther apart, both in their own positions and in the perception of the public. What's especially dangerous about this polarization, to my mind, is that it's not just ideological. It is also racial. White voters voted by large majorities for Republicans, 58% to 40%. That's the white vote in this election. Whites without a college degree are especially strong Republican voters. They supported the Republicans 66 to 32, more than 2 to 1. That's white voters without a college education. Even white women as a whole, despite the pro-choice backlash, as I said before, still voted Republican 53 to 45. Non-white voters voted by even larger majorities for Democrats, 68% to 30. So white voters are 58-40 Republican, non-white voters are 68-30 for Democrats. So if our politics begins to generate more political violence, that violence could easily take on something of the character of a race war. It may also take on the form of the young against the old, as even white voters under 30 voted for Democrats, as I said before, 58 to 40, the exact reverse of how white voters overall voted. So there's a big generational gap. There's a big racial gap in the voting statistics. What about the future? Are we doomed to have another election with Joe Biden against Donald Trump? I think so. Let me run this through. If Biden decides to run, opposition to him within the Democratic Party is very divided. Lots of people don't want him to run, but some of them are progressive, some of them are centrist, some of them are more moderate. Would they gather around a single alternative? Seems unlikely. What if a single brave opponent runs against Biden? Elizabeth Warren decides she's going to run against Biden. I think they will be accused of dividing the party and helping Trump. And I think Dems will reluctantly rally around Biden, even though they say they don't want him to be the candidate again. And so I think if Biden runs, I think he's the nominee. Well, what if he doesn't run? If he declines to run, who's the logical heir apparent? Kamala Harris. But her favorability ratings are no better than his. She would almost certainly face opposing candidates. Probably a bunch of them. There'd be a free-for-all. Gavin Newsom would run. Pete Buttigieg would run. Maybe Gretchen Whitmer would run. There'd be a bunch of people running. But anyone who beats her for the nomination would be seen by Black voters, especially Black women, who are the most loyal part of the Democratic base, as depriving the first Black woman with a shot at the presidency from her rightful due. This would lead to bitter feelings and a weak Black turnout in the general election. So a very difficult scenario for Democrats, whether Biden decides to run or decides not to run. Well, how about the Republican side? On the Republican side, even if most Republicans would prefer someone else than Trump, and some polls show that, if Trump runs, and that seems inevitable, he looks like he's going to announce day after tomorrow, no single opponent has a national following that could beat him. I don't think Ron DeSantis would beat him. And challenging him unsuccessfully could be the end of your career in Republican politics. So if Donald Trump runs, I don't think Ron DeSantis will oppose him. If several candidates oppose him, he can easily win the nomination with just 35 or 40% of the primary vote, like he did in 2016. So I think the likelihood is a Biden-Trump rematch, even though nobody wants to see that.
Want to watch it over there?
I think Biden defeats Trump more easily than he did last time, because I think Trump is fading and is becoming more unpopular all the time. But politics is unpredictable. And the big lie that Trump won in 2020 is still alive and well out there. If nominated, there is always still a chance that we could see a return of Trump. So I started this talk with Phew, because the Democrats did so relatively well. But I want to end with a whoa, don't get too excited. The future is far from settled, and American democracy is far from secure.
Todd has a question. He's typed his name into chat, so he'll be our first questioner.
Hi, Jeff. Always good to see you and always good to have you here. I'm on Zoom. Thank you so much. My question is, one of the things about the big lie that I was so disappointed by Democrats was the big lie seems so improbable to me. I mean, why can't they just say that presidents who oversee pandemics and say that they're going to disappear don't win elections? And I think we need to have more of that dialogue in order to kill the big lie.
Well, you know, the pandemic thing is strange. Ron DeSantis did a terrible job on the pandemic. The proportion of Floridians who died in the pandemic was one of the worst in the country, and it had no effect on him. You know, he blustered his way through saying he was going to defend against school closures and against masks, and he had a Surgeon General of the state who was a vaccine denier, who incidentally just got elected to the Congress. And yet he won his governor's race by 20%. Well, you can't gerrymander the statewide race, right? You know, he won the statewide race by 20 points. Now he gerrymandered some congressional districts in South Florida. So, and I don't think hostility to Trump has much to do with how badly he botched the pandemic. The election denialism hurts him. Just the general circus surrounding Trump has turned people off more and more. But strangely, I don't think pandemic failure has hurt governors or presidential candidates very much. It should. I mean, looking at that, Trump is one of the big mass murderers in modern history. Maybe 300 or 400,000 Americans died who didn't have to because of the way he handled the pandemic, which was just outrageous. But that doesn't seem to create a political price.
Thank you.
Al Christians, come on. He's at Friendly House. You got to go up to the mic. There you go.
Jeff, you talked about the demographics and how the young people are going Democratic. And, you know, I think, oh, that's very interesting. More people are turning 18 every day. And, oh, that's probably another 1/4%, 0.5% for the Democrats in all the races in even in 2 years' time, because of because we're all dying, all the old folks are dying. The question is, what happens to the people who are already in that youth category already for the Democrats as they get older? Do they get ground down by life and society and get upset and become radicalized on the conservative side, saying the whole modernity sucks, let's be a Republican? Or do they
I think something
or do they get rich and say, oh, I'm rich, let's be a Republican?
I think something like that is happening. I mean, more and more people are turning 18 every day, but more and more people are turning 30 every day too.
Right.
And as we used to say, don't trust anybody over 30.
So what's happening there? Do you think that any of these people are going to stay Democrats?
Yes, I think quite a few of them will remain Democrats. This youth vote for the Democrats is much stronger than it was a generation ago, say. But one of the demographic things that's interesting is people who are married and have children, but even just people who are married, vote strongly Republican. Single women vote strongly Democratic. Unmarried people who haven't gotten married yet vote strongly Democratic. The abortion issue is really strong, I think, among unmarried women and unmarried people generally. But once you have a mortgage and you have kids and you have a job, you have a career, the conservative ethos of most organizations in which you work, I think, makes a difference. You start paying more attention to economic issues like inflation, that it's harder to put, food on the table and so forth. So I think there is a conservatism that sets in with age. Now, hopefully, one of the reasons that young people are voting so heavily Democratic is cultural issues. They don't like the anti-abortion stuff. They don't like the anti-gay legislation. They don't like the anti-trans rhetoric. They don't like legislatures dictating school curriculum and say you can't teach about racism in the schools, et cetera. I think whereas older folks, people who are our age mostly, sorry, you're not included, tend to feel like, the world is going to hell because, what's this stuff with gay people and trans people, and they're on sports teams, and what are they teaching in the schools? This is old folks on telling people to get off the lawn kind of issues. And because they're reflecting the cultural values that they had when they were 30. So I think as these more culturally progressive youth become older, they aren't going to respond to that kind of crap as much as people over 50, say, do now. So I think it is a trend that persists, but not as strongly as they're voting now. I think people do seem to become more conservative once they marry and have families and are settled into their professional lives.
We have a question from Hank Robb from the Zoom audience. His question is, I have often heard the question, when will there be a woman president? I think the answer is when white women vote for one. What's your view?
Yeah, that would help. As I recall, white women didn't vote for Hillary,
No.
but I'm not sure about that, but I think that's fine. You've got to have a candidate, first of all, who's got sort of a national reputation and a very solid experiential record, because I think a woman's going to have to show a stronger resume than a man would. Kamala Harris obviously is in a strong position as vice president, but she hasn't impressed people much so far, so she may be squandering her opportunity. One scenario that I think would be interesting is if Joe Biden sort of looks at the landscape and says, if I don't run, the Democratic Party is going to be terribly divided and we might lose. So I better run. I'll beat Trump. And then a year into my presidency, I'll resign due to health reasons or old age or something, and Kamala Harris can become president. And then she'll have 2 or 3 years to establish herself as a competent, effective, persuasive president and win election in her own right. That's a conceivable scenario for me. But you can't get a female president until you get a collection of women who have the resume and the public resonance to support that kind of campaign. And right now, we really don't have that.
We have a question from Ann Henderson.
Oh, by the way,
Oh.
on that thought, in New Zealand, not only do they have a female prime minister, but in their last election, they have now elected a majority of women to their national parliament. It's the first parliament in the world that has a female majority.
Nice.
Right. Ann, go ahead.
I wanted to know, what do you think about the Trump card in this is Trump's is Merrick Garland and all the other things about whether Trump will be indicted and convicted. And, if convicted, he can't run.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
Well, it depends on what he's convicted of.
Oh.
Some of the things that he might get charged with would disqualify him. Some of them
Like the New York ones that are all about money and it's a civil case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read a really discouraging thing today, just so frustrating. It appears that the Justice Department has been observing this informal 60-day rule that
Yeah.
you don't start prosecutions within 60 days of an election if the prosecutions might have an effect on the election. Well, the election's over, right? So let's indict Trump. No, the election is not over because in December 6th, you have the runoff in Georgia. And so they're saying, again, we can't prosecute anybody that would have an impact on that election until that election's over. So that's another, what, I guess that's 3 weeks away,
Yeah.
3.5 weeks
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
So it looks like they're not going to come out with an indictment until then either. Trump just filed suit against the January 6th committee to say it's illegitimate to subpoena an ex-president. And that will probably drag out beyond the inauguration of the new Congress. And if the Republicans have a majority, they'll kill that committee and withdraw the subpoena. And people are saying, why did the January 6th committee wait till October 22 to issue the subpoena for Trump? Why weren't they doing it in October 21? They knew it would, drag out. So that looks like that's going to be a problem too. I think my sense is that Merrick Garland is gearing up to indict him over Mar-a-Lago and maybe over January 6th. And that would be amazing. Now, one of the problems with indicting Trump is you've got to get a jury to convict him. And if you get a random jury out there, except maybe in Washington, D.C., it's going to have some Trump supporters on it who will believe anything that Trump says, who believe the big lie. And so you might get hung juries, even where the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that he's guilty. So you really have to have all your ducks in a row. And I think that's what Merrick Garland is feeling. I don't want there to be any hint that this is a politically motivated prosecution. I want our evidence. I want to indict him on clearly and easily provable things where the evidence is overwhelming, because otherwise a worse outcome would be to indict him and then have him found innocent by a hung jury, or not guilty by a hung jury.
Okay, now you've made me sad again.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of a Debbie Downer.
There's a question from Dave. I'm not sure which of the Daves it is, but in the chat, was there a previous president who was a cult personality like Trump and rose to the top by telling whatever lie he would win over followers?
Was there ever a previous one?
Yeah, was in the past. Was there another president like Trump who just lied and people believed him? Like,
no, not in our country. I can't. Well,
yeah.
The politician who comes to mind is Hitler, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Who came to power on the big lie that the Germans hadn't really lost World War I, but had been stabbed in the back by Jews and socialists while they were winning on the battlefield. I mean, this was an out and out lie, but it was widely believed in Germany, and not just by Nazis. I mean, the whole nationalist conservative half or more of the German electorate more or less believed that lie, and it helped him rise to control of Germany. No, we've never had anything like this. I mean, we've had presidential candidates who had outrageous things. We had Nixon, who ran on sort of appealing to Southern racists after the civil rights laws and things. We've had presidents who lied plenty. I've been reading about Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh in the approach to World War II. Roosevelt lied every other day about what he was doing and what he wanted and so forth. And he ended up successfully getting us into World War II with a little help from the Japanese. Nixon lied a lot. LBJ lied a lot about Vietnam. I mean, presidents lie a lot, but nothing like the big lie that, oh, I didn't really lose the election. It was a fraud, and you ought to resist it by every means necessary.
Preston, can you come to the mic, please, and ask your question?
I'd like to hear your views on what happened in the 3rd Congressional District in Washington. I'm a resident over there and
Oh,
very happy about that. So what do you think?
well, I think it's very interesting. For those of you who haven't been following that, this is Jamie Herrera Butler was the Republican incumbent. Pretty conservative person. It's a pretty conservative district, but she couldn't accept the big lie. And so she didn't vote to overturn the election, and she voted to impeach Trump. And so Trump went after her like he went after all the Republicans who voted to impeach, all of whom are gone now. He embraced this sort of nutcase Joe Kent in the primary, who's a rabid election denier and has got all kinds of other weird things in his resume and a lot of connections to extreme right-wing Christian nationalists and neo-Nazi groups and all kinds of stuff. But he won. He beat her in the primary. And they had a primary where it was everybody runs together. That's how it works in Washington now. So you don't have a Republican primary and a Democratic primary. All the candidates run. And she came in 3rd, narrowly. And so, what is her name? Perez, Marie Gusenhamp Perez. I think she uses her middle name to sort of undercut her Hispanic last name because she worries in the conservative district that white voters are going to vote against a Hispanic, but how can they vote against a Gusenhamp? And so then it was a pretty close race. And most of the national rating agencies put it in the lean Republican column, because even though Joe Kent was a terrible candidate, it's a heavily Republican district. Well, all the news agencies yesterday declared her the victor. So Joe Kent lost. And this moderate Democrat has won. And it means that the Republican majority in the House, even if they get it, is one less than people thought the other day. I've been watching these projections. So like MSNBC was projecting a few days ago that the Republicans were going to end up with 222 seats in the House. Well, then it became 221. And then it became 220. And now their projection is 219. Well, you have to have 218 to have a majority. So if they get 219, they've got a 1-seat margin. And a lot of the remaining races that still haven't been called are in California. And I just have a feeling that more of those are going to go blue than has been anticipated. So and they're saying it's 219 plus or minus 4. Well, minus 4 would make 215, and that means the Democrats would have 220. Minus 2 would mean the Democrats have 218, and the Republicans have 217. So there's still that outside chance. But the Washington district is one that gives the Democrats hope. And what made the difference? I think abortion made a difference there, and I think the Democratic candidate harping on Joe Kent's radical extremist connections made a difference. And there were questions about, he claimed to be employed by this company that it's not even clear the company existed. And if it does, it's not clear that he was doing any work there. I mean, it's just one thing after another. I mean, he's one of these Trump candidates who, in addition to being an election denier, just weird. Like Doug Mastriano and the guy whose name I forget, who's running for Secretary of State in Arizona, is just a wacko. And so Trump not only got candidates on the ballot who were outside the mainstream, but who were just weird folks. Blake Masters is just weird. And so that's an extreme example. Nobody thought that seat would flip, and now it has.
What if Trump, how will it affect the campaign if Trump is under indictment and he declares.
I don't think it'll make a big difference. If he's convicted, even if he's not allowed to run, if he's convicted of something by a jury, I think that could make a difference. But the indictment by itself plays right into his rhetoric that the deep state is out to get him. The liberals are out to get him. This is all a hoax. This is all just persecution. It's conceivable that it could even gin up enthusiasm among his voters to go out and elect him anyway, to own the libs and thumb their nose in the face, to the people who are persecuting our dear leader. So I'm not sure it'll make a big difference, a mere indictment. And the trial could take forever to come to trial. The justice system in this country is so slow about this stuff. I mean, he should have been in jail a year and a half ago. He should have been in jail 10 years ago. I mean, he's been committing tax evasion and business fraud as long as he's been in business. And people have looked the other way for decades.
Joyce has a question. Come on up, Joyce.
I wondered, you're saying that Biden could beat Trump in a rematch. And I wonder how much of that is actually related to Biden's accomplishments. I don't see much attention being paid to that, either on either side is not praising it very much. How much of it is due to that? And is there an indication, this is maybe a second part of the same question, and you're going to say, no, there's not a snowball's chance in hell, but I've seen a couple of nice things come out of the Republicans. You mentioned Laxalt's fairness, and Dr. Oz called Fetterman to concede and make some nice comments. Is there any chance that there's a little bit of that rising in the Republicans?
I think there's a little bit of that rising in the Republicans, just as there was after January 6th. And I think it's going to get stamped out quickly, just as it did after January 6th. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy came out with, and Lindsey Graham came out with these really strong anti-Trump statements right after January 6th. And by a month later, McCarthy was going down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring, and Mitch McConnell was falling silent, and Lindsey Graham was getting back on the bandwagon, and is now like promoting this ridiculous thing about Laxalt, that it's mathematically impossible for him to lose, when it was very obvious that it was mathematically likely that he would lose at that point. So about Joe Biden's accomplishments, I mean, he put through these three big pieces of legislation: the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has all this climate change stuff in it, and
the CHIPS Act.
Out of the war, I think, is sort of a mixed thing. I mean, people thought it was terrible the way he did it, but people are glad that he's not there, and it's not a thing around his neck.
What about the CHIPS Act?
Happens about all these achievements is they haven't had much of any effect. The effects are going to start being felt next year. And if he can get the student loan thing past the courts somehow or another, those things are going to kick in. And I think when they kick in, that's going to help a lot. The other thing that's happening is, at last, inflation does appear to be coming down.
Yeah.
Well, if inflation comes down to regular levels, and employment remains strong, and by 2024, the economy is growing, that will all be very helpful to Joe Biden. But I think more than that, I think Joe Biden will win because people won't be able to stomach having Trump in office again. And so it won't be, Biden's approval ratings may soar up to 47% from 43%. But I think it'll be anti-Trump stuff. There was this election in France, and I can't remember what the year was, but Le Pen was running, the father, not the daughter. And Jacques Chirac, the conservative, was president. And Jacques Chirac was a highly unpopular president, and he was under investigation for corruption. His election looked like it was in trouble. But in the first round of the elections, France has a system where they have a first round and then the top two candidates go to a runoff. And in the first round, Le Pen beat the socialists with like 17% of the vote or something like that. And the socialists only had 15. So the runoff was between this highly unpopular conservative, Jacques Chirac, and Le Pen. Well, people were horrified at the choice, but everybody except Le Pen's party rallied around Chirac. The socialists voted for him, the communists voted for him, everybody voted for him. And so Le Pen, in the second round, his vote went from like 17% to 19%. And Chirac got like 81%. It was the biggest landslide in French electoral history, but it wasn't because anybody liked Chirac. And I think you might get that in 2024, that people are still sort of basically pretty lukewarm towards Joe Biden. He hasn't persuaded many more independents or Republicans that he's a good president, but Trump will be even more unpopular than he is now. And people will just say, well, you know, I'm not very enthusiastic about Biden, but he's okay. And Trump is a horror. And so I think that's why he might win. I mean, I'm very depressed at the prospect of another Biden-Trump election. I mean, it's time for some new faces, for God's sake, in both parties. Younger, yeah, somebody who's under 80, you know. Well, Michelle seems to be completely, you know, I have a thing about Obama. I wrote a letter to Obama when he was running in 2008 because he invited people to write to him about whether he should run, right? I knew he would never read any of these things, but I wrote off to him and said, you're too young, you're too inexperienced, you're not ready. Wait, let Hillary be president. And then, the guy who I really thought should have been elected president in 2008 was Joe Biden, who destroyed his campaign in the first week by saying some stereotypical things about Black people in trying to awkwardly praise Barack Obama, and his campaign crashed. But in all the debates that year with Hillary and Barack and Joe Biden was clearly the best. He was great in the debates. I think Joe Biden should have been president in 2008 and 2012 with Barack Obama as his vice president. They should have been switched. After 2 terms as vice president, Obama would have been ready to run for president. He would have beat Trump, and we'd be now in Barack Obama's second term. He looks great. He's better now than when he was president. But Biden is over the hill. So Biden should have been president while he still was able, and then Barack Obama should have been president when he was ready, but it didn't work out that way. But it looks very weird for the ex-president to be this powerhouse and the current president, you know, sort of stumbling around.
Johnny, are you, yeah, can you come on up? You're ready to ask a question, please.
Given that the House of Representatives seats are determined by the population of the states and shouldn't vary, it seems to me it's always been an uneven number in the House, which means no ties. Why is that? Why is it always an uneven number? It doesn't seem, is that just a coincidence? And if it was an even number, what would they do in case of a tie?
I was going to say it's in the Constitution, but I don't think it is. But I think it's set by statute that there are going to be 435 members of the House, so that when the population goes up, they recalculate. And some states lose representatives and some states gain representatives. So after the last census, for example, Oregon gained a 6th seat, which unfortunately looks like it's going to go to the Republicans. So we're going to end up with 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans instead of 4 Democrats and 1 Republican. But that's what happens, so that they always stick with the 435 number. I was going to say it's in the Constitution, but can't be in the Constitution. They didn't want 435 members of the House in 1789, but it's fixed.
Does that go back to the 1890 or to the 1790s?
No, no.
435.
I don't
When
know.
was that said? I don't understand
know
it.
how long we've had 435, but it's been
Seems like-
50 years
it-
at least.
it seems like a long
it may be back to end of World War II or something. I'm not sure when that got fixed.
Kathy Moyd has a question. She's on Zoom. Come on in, Kathy.
Hi.
If she-
I was wondering, you just made one comment about the Oregon elections, and I'm wondering if you've done a bit more on Oregon. Obviously, we had the interesting governor's race, but apparently the Democrats have lost their supermajority, which could make budgeting very difficult. So I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I haven't followed that very closely. One good thing is, and a lot of Republicans voted for it too, there was this measure on the ballot that said, if you have more than 10 unexcused absences, you're thrown out of the legislature. I think it's not just that
you can't run again.
Oh, you can't run again. Well, the Republicans have discovered this tactic of, well, we can't win the vote, but if we just leave, then the House or the Senate won't have a quorum. And so we can block legislation. They've done this several times. And the sergeant of arms of the House or the Senate can go after them and basically arrest them and drag them back. So what they do is they go out of state. They go over to Boise or Salt Lake City or someplace, San Francisco, Paris, wherever they want to go. And this has been effective. In some states, Democrats have been imitating this. I think in Texas, Democrats were doing this and elsewhere. I think it's awful. I mean, I think it's just a complete distortion of so that happened. So that although the supermajority is gone, the Republicans are not going to be able to pull this, we're going to leave the state, or at least they can't do it for more than 9 days. And so that'll make a difference. But I think there's another case of where Democrats were not particularly concentrated on legislative races. They were concentrated on those congressional races and the governor's race. It shows that there was a red ripple going through the country. And one of the things, I think it came out in the governor's race, the deterioration of the quality of life in Portland, then amplified and exaggerated tenfold by conservatives and conservative media, I think had an impact. So this emphasis on fighting crime and why aren't the Democrats doing anything about homelessness and so forth, I think that had an impact. It had an impact on the Portland City Council race.
Yeah.
And so, that happened, but they still have a strong majority. And so, and they don't have to have a veto-proof majority because they're going to be a Democratic governor. The outcome in the governor's race, I think, was surprisingly strong for Democrats, because I thought Christine Drazan ran an excellent campaign. She's a very attractive candidate, very articulate. She wasn't an election denier. She didn't push the abortion issue, and you couldn't run on the abortion issue against her, because even if she were elected governor, there's no way for her to create anti-abortion legislation in the state. And so she ran a very good campaign. Betsy Johnson, I thought, ran a really good campaign for a long time, but people finally realized, hey, the choice is between Drazan and Kotek. And so Betsy Johnson's support went from like 30% down to 9%. And she was drawing more votes from the Democrat than from the Republican. I think it's still probably true that her 9% probably hurt Kotek more than it did Drazan, and Kotek has won by 4%. Well, that's more than, who's the doctor who was governor?
Kitzhaber.
That's better than Kitzhaber did when he ran against the Blazer, whose name I forget too, who was a favorite player of mine. Dudley, yeah. He didn't beat Dudley by 4 points. Dudley just about won that race, and there was an earlier race where the Democrat almost got beat. So in that sense, Kotek really did quite well, winning by 4 votes when there was a third party candidate who was probably draining off more Democratic votes than Republican ones. Other big thing that happened in Oregon was this change in the government of the city of Portland. That's a big deal. I mean, I'm in favor. I voted for that. I think probably as they implement it, it's going to have glitches and problems that will need to be fixed. I don't know what they are, but there'll be some. But it's going to do a couple of things. I think city manager form of city government is a good idea. You get a professional in there, they do that. They're supervised by the mayor and the city council. And we're going to double the size of the city council from 6 to 12. They're going to be 4 districts with 3 seats each. And those are going to be determined together in a ranked choice voting system. And what that tends to do is it creates more opportunities for minority candidates of various kinds to win. So we'll probably get a more diverse city council, which will be good, I think, and we'll get a city manager. This system of the city council people are the administrators of departments. Nobody does that anymore. It used to be popular a long ago. Nobody does that anymore, and it's created all kinds of problems, including frequent incompetence by the city council administrators. So that was a big deal, and I think that's neat. But I really like that we voted, and it was overwhelming. Voted. If you have all these unexcused absences, then you can't run again.
We'll close with one last question from Mike Boucher. The Republican Party seems to have degenerated to a franchise similar to quackery and pseudoscience, where charlatans can profit from public misconceptions. Is that their future?
I think it's their future for quite a while. I think it's going to mean that they're going to have, I hope it means they're going to have less and less electoral success, if they're going to get punished for it. But it's sort of a cult. And I think it will take a lot of failures before this genie can be put back in the bottle. Because if you try to stand up to it right now, it's the end of your political career. I mean, name me one person who stood up to the MAGA wing of the Republican Party who's survived politically. There's just a long list of them. One of them is now president of the University of Florida.
That's right.
Decided to get out before he got thrown out. So I think it will happen, but boy, it's going to take a long time. I don't see suddenly, in 2024, Liz Cheney is going to run for president and Republicans will say, oh, we were wrong. Let's make Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger our ticket. That's not going to happen.
Well, also, how many innocent people are going to get dragged down to tragic ends before these changes occur?
A lot. I mean, we're going to have these horrific anti-abortion laws in, half the states, and people are going to die as a result of that. And there are going to be all kinds of weird tragedies from that. All this anti-gay and anti-trans legislation and stuff in the schools is going to create more hostility for gay and trans teenagers. There are going to be more suicides as a result. I mean, these things have real life consequences.
Yeah, I call it slow motion Holocaust.
Yeah. Well, and like I said before, I think Trump is responsible for 300 to 400,000 extra dead from the pandemic. And Ron DeSantis is probably responsible for, 5 or 10,000 more deaths in Florida than were necessary. So even if they're not in power, their ability to block things and their control of lots of state legislatures. And I think one of the things that can happen, one of the things that's happened in recent years is liberals and progressives have been moving to liberal and progressive places, and conservatives have been moving to conservative places. I think all these states that are passing anti-gay and anti-abortion legislation are going to experience an influx of conservative immigrants and an outflow of liberal and progressive who say, God, I thought I could tolerate being in Georgia because Atlanta here is pretty progressive and so forth, but I can't take it anymore. I'm moving to Portland or Seattle or someplace.
Jeff, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. It was just wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Right.